let's give a lay of the land, insulin 101, when things are working properly, and then what triggers that change.
Yes. Okay. So when I learned all of this just by studying my husband, Tom. So Tom got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 15. So since 15 years old, he has been giving himself synthetic insulin. And because his pancreas stopped producing it when he was 15. And so we've got to see firsthand what foods actually cause a blood sugar spike. Because most people are walking around and they're eating, and maybe some of them are wearing continuous glucose monitors and they're testing their blood glucose and they're thinking, oh, I ate an apple or I ate some sourdough bread or avocado toast or whatever. And my blood sugar went up for a minute, but then it went back down. So I must not have any issues with my blood sugar or with insulin. And that couldn't be further from the truth. That's actually a very dangerous mindset to have, because in those people, their insulin is working. That's why they see the blood sugar go up for a minute and then it goes back down. At the moment it goes back down is when insulin has kicked on. It has entered the cell's receptor and it has transported the glucose across the cell membrane into the cell. And when you do that, it lowers the glucose in the blood. So the blood is the transport for all the glucose, and along with it comes insulin. And every time you have insulin near a cell, it will open up the cell and allow glucose to transport through, in turn taking that glucose out of the blood and registering it intracellularly. So a lot of people think they don't have a blood sugar issue. I was one of them. My fasting glucose every morning was 80. That's where the doctors want you to be. I thought it was perfect, but I was experiencing hypoglycemic moments all the time. Hangry, I'd get shaky, I'd feel like I was going to pass out, that low blood sugar feeling, super irritable and really hungry. And what I didn't realize was, my fasting blood glucose was 80 because my insulin and my cell receptors were still working. So I was producing a lot of insulin, it was dropping my blood sugar down, and everything was working fine. But what happens eventually over time is that system wears out. It's like a keyhole. If you imagine a door and you imagine the keyhole and the keyhole is locked, and the only way to go through the door is to unlock it. So imagine that insulin is the key, and every time it goes into the keyhole, it has to turn the keyhole so that you can go through the door and pretend you're glucose. That's how the system works. Insulin is the key. Glucose is what's supposed to be going through the door, and your cell wall, your cell membrane is the door. So insulin unlocks it through the receptor, and the receptor is the keyhole. If you have too much insulin hitting that receptor too frequently, then that receptor wears out. And that's called insulin resistance. Then your body becomes resistant to insulin and it doesn't hear the sound of insulin anymore. And that's where you develop type 2 diabetes later down the road. So what we did with our first, when Tom and I were first figuring all of this out, is we tracked his blood glucose and we watched those foods that made his blood glucose go really high. Now, he's had this since he was 15, so he already pretty much knew, but we really started narrowing in like basic foods. So for example, he would eat a ribeye steak, just a ribeye steak, and we'd sit and watch what his blood glucose did. And after, 3 or 4 hours, his blood glucose starts going up and up and up. And eventually it'd get up over 300 and it would just sit there for hours and hours, even until the next day. And so what was happening is he would have to give himself insulin, and he'd give himself insulin and it still wouldn't work. And then he'd give himself more insulin and it still wouldn't work. His blood sugar would stay high. And we're like, what in the world here? This is just meat, right? This isn't supposed to be making your blood sugar so high. It's just meat and fat. But that wasn't the case at all. It was making his blood sugar a disaster, and it was locking it in. And he told me, he said, I have this problem when I eat really high fat, my blood sugar stays locked in and I can't get it to come down. So I have to give myself a shit ton of insulin to get it to come down. And that moment was like a light bulb moment for me. And I thought, this is why the keto diet didn't work for me. This is why the, eating just carnivore didn't work and doesn't work for so many people, because a lot of people don't understand. You're breaking protein down to glucose, and that glucose is turning into sugar. You're raising your blood sugar with the protein in the glucose slowly over time. This is why it'll stay locked in for hours. And then you have the fat behind it. Well, fat slows the absorption of insulin. And remember what I just taught you about, the insulin is the key to get into the receptor. Dietary fat, specifically saturated fat, in the bloodstream will cause a slow insulin absorption. Anytime you have a slowered insulin transport or absorption into the cell, that insulin's not getting in there, what happens is your blood sugar stays high because insulin lowers the blood sugar. Your blood sugar stays high, so your brain says, oh shit, our blood sugar's high. We got to do something about that. Let's produce more insulin. And that's what we were seeing with Tom, is he was having to give himself so much insulin. And every time he gave himself insulin, I thought, well, that's what my body's doing, right? We eat the same exact foods, the same exact meal, the same amount of protein, the same amount of fat. If he had to give himself an enormous amount of insulin, I knew my body was producing an enormous amount of insulin, if not more. So I realized, okay, anything Tom does to have to overcorrect with insulin and give himself more insulin, that's the same effect in my body. And insulin's the master fat storing hormone. So anytime I'm producing way more insulin, I'm producing way more fat. So, and that's the simple, I know that sounds complex and like, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, but this is specifically what we do in Primal Bod program, is we teach women how to understand this fuel system so that they know for the rest of their lives. Because in my opinion, we should have been taught this in health class in 8th grade, and we weren't. And it's very apparent when you look around and you see people walking the streets. They don't understand how insulin works either. So we have all these foods out there in the world that are incredibly toxic to us. And then we have these foods that society thinks are natural foods and that are actually foods that are healthy for you, like the fruits and vegetables, right? Those are all supposed to be healthy. And what I learned with Tom is that's not the case. So if I would make Tom a smoothie back in the day when we were paleo, and I would put, fruit, banana, maybe some almond butter and, just like Greek yogurt and some berries, and make him this smoothie. And I would give it to him to drink, and his blood sugar would go through the roof. The same as if he had a blizzard from Dairy Queen. And I was like, why doesn't anyone know about this? I can't be the first, but come to find out, I think I am. I think I'm the first to really set people down. That's why I say it's the most serendipitous thing that ever happened. And I believe it's a gift from God that I got graced with this, undying, love for nutrition and natural health, paired with marrying a type 1 diabetic that I love, that's my soulmate. And that's how we were able to figure all of this out and, I spent hours researching all of this and trying to figure out, like, how does this work? How come no one knows about this? It was so frustrating. But now I've given up on that. I know that it's all about, here and now, and being able to teach people how insulin works and what foods are spiking your insulin and what activities are spiking your insulin and what you can do about it.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
The reason my program is so different is because I target insulin. Most people today are overproducing insulin. They're eating foods that are triggering a high insulin response, and they're loaded with insulin. Insulin is the master fat